Ever get that feeling? Like you're just completely swamped, notifications dinging, emails piling up, and you just can't help but check your phone, even when you know there's probably nothing new.
Oh, absolutely. It's almost like an involuntary reflex at this point.
Right. And it's not just us. Apparently, iPhone users spend like a whole extra 26 minutes each day glued to their phones compared to Android users.
Seriously.
Yeah, it's almost a half hour just like vanished, sucked into the digital void.
It really makes you wonder if we're spending so much time on things that are actually making us more stressed out than not.
Well, the stuff that really helps us recharge and feel good, just gets pushed aside.
It's like we've collectively forgotten, or maybe it's more like a mass generational amnesia, as some are calling it, about how beneficial being in nature actually is for us. I mean, think about it. For almost all of human history, we were so deeply connected to nature.
Yeah, totally. It was just part of life, wasn't it?
Exactly. But now, with so many people living in cities, and of course, with our devices always within reach, that connection has gotten so weak. And the thing is, we might not even realize what we're missing out on.
And the numbers really paint a clear picture, don't they?
Hmm.
Kids in America and Britain, they only spend about half as much time outdoors as their parents did. And get this, they're spending up to 7 hours a day on screens.
Wow. 7 hours.
And that's not even including schoolwork.
That's basically like a whole other full-time job, only it's in the digital world.
Exactly. So that's what we're diving into today, why nature is so good for us. We're going to really dig into the science behind how it boosts our happiness, our health, even our creativity.
It's amazing to think about, isn't it? This isn't just some new age trend. Like, Aristotle, he believed that walking in nature actually helped clear his mind.
And then you've got huge thinkers like Darwin, Tesla, Einstein. They all got inspiration from spending time in their gardens and groves.
Absolutely. It's not just these interesting historical anecdotes either. There's a whole bunch of scientific research now that actually backs up those beliefs.
So what are we looking at today specifically?
Well, we're going to be looking at how nature impacts everything. Our general mood, how we feel overall, even some pretty crucial mental functions, like how well we remember things, our ability to plan ahead, our creativity, and even how well we can focus.
All of that from just being in nature. It seems pretty incredible.
It is, and we'll touch on how it affects the way we connect with other people too.
Sounds like a lot to cover.
It is. Now, some of the stuff we're going to talk about might sound a little surprising, and it's always a good idea to approach things with a healthy dose of skepticism. But we're going to lay out the evidence for you.
And just to be clear, we're not saying ditch your phones, abandon technology, and go live off the grid.
Oh, definitely not. I mean, we're all part of this digital world.
Exactly. But what we do want to do is help you understand how much of our lives have moved indoors and what that shift might be doing to our brains and our bodies.
It's about finding a balance, right? Not about completely cutting ourselves off from technology.
Exactly. Driving safety tip. As you start your day, remember to check your mirrors frequently before changing lanes, turning, or even just slowing down. It's a simple habit that can make a big difference in your safety and the safety of others. So let's take a step back for a minute and think about how much things have changed. The move to cities, it's a pretty recent thing in human history, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It wasn't until around 2008 that, for the first time ever, more people were living in urban areas than in rural areas.
And it's pretty likely that most of our listeners are part of that, living in or near a city.
Right. And what's really interesting is that this shift to cities might actually be creating a disconnect between our bodies and the environments they were designed for. Think about it. Our nervous systems evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in nature.
That's 99.9% of human history, right?
Exactly. But now they're suddenly in these very different, very urban environments.
It's got to be a bit of a shock to the system.
Well, as Miyazaki, this Japanese researcher, points out, our bodies, our physiology, it's still basically wired for nature.
Like we're programmed to be in those natural settings.
Right. And when we can sync up with those natural rhythms, it just makes us feel better, calmer.
It makes total sense.
Of course, Miyazaki's talking about natural environments that are actually restorative, not polluted places or areas that have been messed up by humans. Those wouldn't have the same effect.
That makes sense. You're not going to feel super refreshed sitting next to a highway.
Definitely not. But Miyazaki also makes this really important point. When we're in truly natural outdoor spaces, all 5 of our senses are engaged.
It's like we're experiencing the world on a whole different level.
Exactly. And it's in these places that we feel the most alive, the most connected to the world around us.
It's like our brains, which, as Mira put it, evolved in those wilder settings finally feel like they're home.
That's a great way to put it. And Muir had this interesting contrast, too. He suggested that without that connection to wilderness, we risk becoming like machines, just focused on making money.
And those machines, he adds, can end up with some pretty clogged pipes.
Right, a little humor there. But the research really is backing up this idea. Studies are showing that the kind of constant low-grade stress that's so common in cities can actually change the way our brains work, even the structure of our brains.
Wow.
And this could be making us more vulnerable to things like schizophrenia, anxiety disorders, and even mood disorders.
So it sounds like city living takes a toll.
It can, yeah.
So if that's the case, how does being in nature help us recharge? There's this Japanese practice called Shinrin-yoku, right?
Yes. Shinrin-yoku, often translated as forest bathing.
Sounds so peaceful.
It really is. The term itself was actually created by the Japanese government in 1982 as part of a public health initiative.
So it's relatively new then.
The term is, but the basic ideas behind it, they go way back, to those ancient Shinto and Buddhist traditions.
So what exactly is it all about?
It's all about intentionally immersing yourself in the forest atmosphere, letting nature in through all your senses, the sights, the sounds, the smells, textures, even tastes, if it's appropriate. It's not about strenuous exercise or reaching a destination. It's really just about being present in the natural world.
That sounds lovely.
It is. So for our listeners, just imagine yourself mindfully walking through a park, really paying attention to everything around you.
And the book has this really nice anecdote about the author trying Shinrin-yoku in a grove of sugi pine trees in Japan.
Oh, yes. And they had the special tea there flavored with wasabi root and bark.
I can't even imagine what that would taste like.
It was definitely unique, but the main takeaway was this feeling of deep calm and relaxation that the author felt.
I can see why they call it forest bathing.
Right. And the interesting thing is, this wasn't just some subjective feeling, They actually measured the author's blood pressure before and after the walk, and it had gone down, both for the author and the person they were hiking with. So even a short walk in a green space, if you're really paying attention, it can have real measurable benefits for you.
So it's not just in our heads, it's actually affecting our bodies.
Exactly. And a lot of the research in Japan has been focused on these things called phytoncides.
Fighting what?
Phytoncides. They're basically these airborne chemicals that trees release, especially evergreens.
So interesting.
Right. And Dr. Lee's research has been looking into whether these phytoncides can actually boost our immune systems.
Wow, really?
Yeah, by increasing the activity of natural killer cells or NK cells and anti-cancer proteins.
That's amazing.
It is. But we're still not totally sure if it's because of those specific molecules themselves or just the fact that those forest smells are so calming and stress-reducing.
So it could be either. Or maybe even both.
Exactly. It's worth noting, too, that a lot of the research done in the U.S., they tend to use pictures or videos of nature instead of actually having people be in nature.
So they're not getting the full experience then?
Right. Driving safety reminder. Avoid distractions while driving. Put your phone away and focus on the road. Even a quick glance at your screen can have serious consequences.
So this brings us to another really interesting idea, something called attention restoration theory, or RT.
Oh, RT. Yeah.
And this one really clicked for me because it explains why we feel so drained after a long day in the city.
Right. And basically the theory is that our directed attention, the kind we use to focus on tasks and block out distractions, it's like a finite resource, almost like a mental battery that can get depleted.
Mental battery, I like that.
So just imagine you're trying to navigate a busy city. There's so much going on.
Yeah.
Noise, crowds, you have to constantly filter information, prioritize what to pay attention to.
It's exhausting just thinking about it.
And according to Paul Atchley, all this filtering uses up a ton of mental energy. And that leads to what we call mental fatigue.
So that explains that brain fog feeling at the end of a busy day.
Exactly. And Daniel Levitin, he points out that our brains are always processing tons of information, and using directed attention pulls on a lot of resources like glucose and oxygen in the prefrontal cortex, which are the same resources we need for both thinking and physical activity.
So it's like our brains are working overtime in the city.
That's a good way to put it. So for our listeners, if you're feeling that mental fog, it's probably your directed attention system running low on power.
And that's why just zoning out in nature feels so good.
It's like hitting the reset button, isn't it?
Exactly. You're giving your brain a break from all that intense focus.
Ashley also makes this great point that natural environments, they just have fewer distractions, fewer things competing for your attention.
Unlike our digital world, where there's always something buzzing or popping up.
Right. In nature, you don't have constant notifications and alerts. And that means your brain can actually engage in deeper, more reflective thought.
And Art T also talks about something called soft fascination, right?
Yes. Soft fascination is basically this idea that in nature, there are things that catch our attention, but in a gentle way. They don't demand our focus in the same way that, say, a notification on your phone would.
So like the leaves rustling in the wind.
Exactly. Or the way the sunlight filters through the trees, the movement of water in a stream. They draw our attention without requiring us to really focus in on them.
So it's like our brains can relax and still be engaged.
Right. It allows that directed attention to rest and recharge, which is so different from the constant demands of the city or our devices. So for our listeners, even something as simple as looking out the window at a tree can give you a little bit of that soft fascination and help restore your mental energy.
That's a good reminder to take a break from the screen every now and then. But it's not just about peace and quiet in nature, is it? There's also this whole idea of mystery that plays a role.
Mystery, yeah. It's a fascinating concept. And what Stephen Kaplan, one of the researchers behind attention restoration theory, what he means by mystery, is this sense of wanting to explore further, the feeling that there's more to discover just around the corner, that you can't see everything all at once.
Like a sense of wonder and intrigue.
Exactly. And there's research by Watson that shows that people actually remember scenes with winding paths or partially hidden views better than scenes that are completely open and predictable.
Really?
Yeah, even just brief glimpses of these mysterious scenes seem to improve our memory. So for our listeners, a walk in a park with winding trails might actually be more beneficial for your brain than a walk across a big open field.
So it's good to have a little bit of the unexpected, something to keep us engaged.
It seems that way.
And then, of course, there's just the incredible richness of sensory input you get in nature. The book describes this experience the author had in Juniko, Japan. The sound of cicadas, the sunlight filtering through the leaves, and that earthy smell of damp soil.
It really does paint a picture of total immersion, doesn't it? And that's so important. And there's actually a growing interest in the medical community in using forests for healing.
So, like, forced therapy.
Exactly. And in Korea, there's this doctor, Dr. Park, who's done a lot of work highlighting the benefits of phytoncides. Antibacterial properties, stress reduction, even their potential to lower blood pressure.
That's incredible. Trees are like little pharmacies.
It seems that way. And he's also talked about the antiviral and possibly even anti-cancer properties of compounds that are found in soil, like geosmin.
Geosmin.
Yeah, it's what gives soil that earthy smell. The author mentions feeling much more awake and alert after just a short walk in a Korean forest.
So that feeling of freshness you get after being in nature, there might actually be a real biological reason for it.
Exactly. Driving, safety tip. Pay attention to road signs and traffic signals. They are there to guide you and ensure smooth and safe traffic flow for everyone.
But of course, everyone's different, right? What one person finds relaxing, another might not. The book mentions this funny anecdote about Ruth Ann Ashley and how she wasn't exactly loving those rocky hikes because she's not a fan of heights.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It just shows that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to nature. We all have our preferences, and even our past experiences can influence how we react to different natural environments.
It's true. So how do we figure out what works for us?
Well, there's this really useful idea called the nature pyramid, which was developed by Tim Beatley. And it's basically this recommended diet of nature with everything from short daily interactions to longer, more immersive experiences in wild places.
So it's about getting a variety of experiences, right?
Exactly. A full spectrum of doses of nature, as he calls it. So for our listeners, it's all about figuring out what kind of natural experiences really resonate with you.
And at the base of this pyramid, you have those everyday interactions with nature. Seeing birds in your backyard, the trees on your street, spending time in parks, playing with your pets.
Even just getting sunlight and fresh air, these small regular interactions can really add up.
And the book mentions Singapore as a great example of a city that's really nailed this.
Oh, definitely. They've really integrated nature into their urban design in a way that makes it accessible to everyone.
That's so smart.
Yeah.
But just having green spaces around isn't always enough, is it? The book also talks about a potential dark side if those spaces aren't properly taken care of.
Yeah, Richard Mitchell's research in Europe is really important here. He found that, in general, having more green spaces nearby was linked to better health. But then he uncovered this interesting issue in Scotland.
What was that?
Well, in some of the poorest areas, people weren't actually using the green spaces that were right there. It turned out that a lot of these areas had become run down and neglected, even dangerous in some cases. So instead of being places of relaxation and restoration, they became associated with stress and even fear.
So it's not just about quantity, it's also about the quality of those green spaces and how accessible they are.
Exactly. A neglected park isn't going to have the same benefits. In fact, it might even have the opposite effect.
That's so true. So what can we do about it?
Well, there are some really great programs out there. One example is Branching Out in Scotland. They provide mental health care in outdoor settings, specifically for vulnerable populations.
That sounds like a fantastic program.
It is, and they've had amazing results. People who participate have shown significant reductions in depression, and they're actually more socially connected.
It's great to see that kind of innovative approach to mental health care.
Absolutely. Driving safety reminder. Always wear your seatbelt and make sure all passengers do too. It's the single most effective way to prevent serious injuries in a crash.
Okay, so we've talked about how nature impacts our mood and well-being, but what about our thinking? Like, how does it affect our cognitive abilities?
That's a great question, and David Strayer's research really dives into that.
And what did he find?
Well, he did these studies where he sent people on walks in nature, and then he gave them some cognitive tests. And what he found was that the people who went on nature walks actually performed better on those tests.
Really? Like, how much better?
In one study, people who went on a nature walk showed a 50% improvement on a task that involved creative problem solving.
That's incredible.
It is. But here's the catch. When people used their cell phones during the walk, those cognitive benefits disappeared completely.
Wow. So even just having your phone with you can negate the benefits of being in nature.
It seems that way. And Strayer explains this using attention restoration theory. Those people who weren't using their phones, they were able to fully experience those restorative qualities of nature. That feeling of being away, the soft fascination with the surroundings, the compatibility, and the feeling of being in a vast and restful space.
It's like they were able to fully unplug and let their brains recharge.
Right. But the people who were using their phones, even though they were in nature, they were still multitasking, walking, looking, listening, and also talking or interacting with their phones.
So their brains didn't get a break.
Exactly. They were still using a lot of mental energy, and they weren't able to get that full cognitive reset that nature can offer when we're truly present.
That's a really important takeaway. So even if we're physically in nature, if we're mentally still plugged in, we might be missing out on those benefits.
It seems that way.
And there was that really interesting study in Utah, right, where they actually measured brainwave activity using EEG while someone was in nature.
Yeah, and those initial findings were pretty fascinating. They found that when the author was in nature, their theta wave activity was actually lower compared to when they were in the city.
Theta waves, those are associated with focused mental tasks.
Right, exactly. So what this suggests is that when we're in nature, our prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that's involved in a lot of those higher level thinking functions, it actually gets a chance to relax.
So it's like our brains can finally downshift and recharge.
That's a good way to put it. Driving safety reminder. Never drive under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Impaired driving puts yourself and everyone around you at risk.
So it sounds like nature can be a really powerful tool for our mental well-being, even for helping people who are dealing with trauma.
Absolutely. You know, the idea of nature being useful in psychotherapy is not new. Howard Searles, way back in 1960, he recognized the importance of the non-human environment for our psychological well-being.
He was ahead of his time.
He really was, and the book has these really powerful stories about women veterans who had PTSD, and they went on this river trip in Idaho as part of the Higher Ground program.
Oh, I remember reading about that.
A lot of these women had gone through some incredibly tough experiences. Homelessness, being institutionalized, struggling with depression and anger. Some even had a fear of flying, which is, you know, pretty significant when you're traveling to a wilderness area.
Yeah, that must have been really challenging.
It was. But what was really amazing was how that time spent in the wilderness seemed to help them heal in ways that traditional therapy hadn't been able to.
Wow, so nature was actually therapeutic for them.
It really was. The challenge of navigating the river, the bond they formed with each other, the peacefulness and beauty of the natural environment, it all seemed to create this really safe space for them to work through their experiences and start to recover.
That's really powerful.
It is. And while most of the women found the trip incredibly helpful, it's important to note that for some of them, it wasn't quite long enough.
So the dose of nature matters, just like with everything else.
Exactly. And it also shows that nature isn't a magic cure for everyone.
It's not a one-size-fits-all solution, that's for sure.
Definitely not.
But it seems like the experiences we have in nature, especially when we're young, are really important. The book talks about a connection between kids not having enough time to play and explore outdoors and how it can impact their development.
Yeah, that's some really interesting research done by Jack Panksepp. He worked with young rats, and he found that when they were prevented from freely exploring and playing, their frontal lobes didn't develop properly.
The frontal lobes, those are the parts of the brain that are crucial for things like planning and self-control, right?
Exactly. And as adults, those rats that had been restricted in their play actually displayed more antisocial behavior.
Wow, so it actually changed the way they interacted with others.
It did. Panksepp even came up with this term, play hunger, to describe this fundamental need for these types of experiences. He suggests that if kids don't get enough of that free play and exploration, they might have problems with impulse control and social interactions later on.
It makes you think about how different childhood is today compared to, say, 50 or 100 years ago.
It does, and it actually makes me think about Friedrich Froebel's concept of kindergarten. His whole idea was that learning should be centered around sensory engagement with the natural world.
Ah, so getting your hands dirty,
Yeah.
playing with plants and natural materials, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Froebel understood that deep connection between kids and nature. And what's interesting is that he emphasized learning through hands-on experience, and he believed that kids should be able to direct their own activities. And that was a pretty radical idea back then.
It's pretty different from how a lot of kids learn today, sitting in classrooms looking at screens.
It is, yeah. And sadly, we're seeing some really worrying trends in youth mental health, with more kids being prescribed antidepressants and diagnosed with ADHD, and a rise in anxiety, depression, and even suicide.
It's heartbreaking.
It really is.
Yeah.
And while it's a complex issue with a lot of different factors involved, it's hard not to see a link between this trend and the fact that kids are spending less time in nature and less time engaging in that kind of unstructured outdoor play.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think.
It does. Driving safety tip. Take regular breaks on long drives to avoid fatigue. Stop, stretch, and refresh yourself to stay alert behind the wheel.
So if more and more of us are living in cities, how can we bring more nature into our everyday lives? It seems like a real challenge.
It is, but there's some really promising examples out there of what can be done. Singapore is a great one. They've made a real effort to turn their city into what they call a city in a garden.
So they've really embraced that idea of bringing nature into the urban environment.
They have. And it's been driven by a very clear vision from their leaders. Lee Kuan Yew, one of their early prime ministers, he was a big proponent of this. And it's not just about making the city look pretty. It's also a strategic approach to combating the urban heat island effect and improving air quality.
So it's about making the city healthier and more livable for its residents.
Exactly.
That's amazing. What are some other examples?
Well, there's this idea of biophilic cities, which was developed by Tim Beatley.
Biophilic cities, what does that mean?
It's the idea that we should be designing our cities in a way that actually nurtures and strengthens our connection to nature.
Like building with natural materials or incorporating more green spaces.
Exactly. And we're seeing more and more examples of this around the world. Revitalizing the Los Angeles River, creating safe swimming areas in Copenhagen Harbor, even the big cleanup of the Anacostia River in Washington, D.C. And then there are really unique examples, like Wellington, New Zealand.
What do they do?
They created a public snorkel trail.
A snorkel trail in the city.
Yeah, it's all about creating these cities of awe where nature is integrated into urban life in really surprising and engaging ways.
I love that idea.
Me too. And what's also really inspiring is seeing all the community-led initiatives happening. Groups like Outdoor Afro and Girl Trek are doing great work to increase access to nature for urban communities.
I've heard of Outdoor Afro. They organize hiking and camping trips, right?
They do. And Girl Trek encourages women to walk in their neighborhoods. And then there's the rise of things like adventure playgrounds, which are basically playgrounds that are designed to encourage creative play using natural materials. And then you have tactical urbanism, which is all about using small-scale interventions to make cities more livable.
So like turning a vacant lot into a community garden.
Exactly. All of these efforts, both big and small, are so important in helping us bridge that gap between our increasingly urban lives and our deep-seated human need for connection with nature. Driving safety reminder. Be aware of your surroundings, especially in areas with heavy pedestrian traffic or school zones. Slow down and be prepared to stop.
So as we wrap up today's deep dive, the key takeaway I'm getting is that the benefits of nature, they're not all or nothing.
That's a great point. And it's something that the book really emphasizes. Those benefits, they exist along a spectrum, a dose curve. So we need a variety of interactions with nature, from quick daily glimpses to longer, more immersive experiences.
It's like we need a balanced diet of nature.
Exactly. And it's so important to remember that even those small, regular doses, those everyday encounters with nature, can have a big impact on our lives.
When just taking a walk in your local park or even just noticing the trees on your street.
Right, or caring for your houseplants, or just taking a minute to look up at the sky. These are all like the essential daily vegetables of our nature diet.
I love that analogy. It makes it so much easier to understand.
And hopefully it encourages people to find those small ways to bring more nature into their lives.
Absolutely.
Right.
Because even those small doses can make a big difference in how we feel, how we think, and how we connect with the world around us.
I completely agree.
Well, I think that about wraps it up for today.
It does.
It's been such a fascinating discussion, and I have to say, I'm leaving with this lingering sense of wonder. We've explored a lot of the science behind why nature is so good for us.
Right.
But there's still so much that we don't know, so much that remains a mystery. It's like Strayer said, even with all the brain research they're doing, there are still aspects of what happens in our brains when we're in those wild places that we just don't fully understand.
And that's okay. I think there's something really beautiful about that, you know?
I agree. It's that sense of mystery and awe that keeps us coming back to nature, wanting to learn more, wanting to experience more. And I hope that our listeners will feel inspired to explore their own relationship with nature, to appreciate both the scientific understanding we've gained and that inherent magic that still exists.
Me too. Driving safety tip. As you conclude your journey, make sure your vehicle is parked safely and securely. Engaging your parking brake, especially on inclines, is a simple step that prevents accidents. Drive safely.